everyone. This is Kale Mary.
And this is Soda.
We've returned with another podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the evolution of Star Trek. That is a broad topic, I think, but Soda and I would really like to get into what we know as the original Star Trek show and kind of how it changed over time.
When we say the evolution of Star Trek, don't mean the evolution of the shows, we mean the evolution of the fandom and
Yes.
fan reaction.
And also just in a way in how that somewhat influenced the shows, right? So
Yeah.
with the changing times comes a change in what the audience expects from their TV shows or
Yeah.
their movies. And so we'll really get into how that impacted the franchise itself.
Yeah. I mean, we are talking about, Star Trek has been around since the 60s, and technology has changed so much since then, and the media landscape has changed so much since then. And audience involvement in TV shows and movies has also changed very, very significantly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you talk about a franchise that's been running over 50 years,
Yeah.
you've got multiple generations involved, right? And so, and I think we all recognize like each generation's different, kind
Yeah.
of in what their
Definitely.
expectations are. Um, and just how do you bring in new fans, right? When the content that they're watching today doesn't look like 60s Star Trek.
Yeah.
All right, Soto, which topic should we start with?
Well, I mean, let's look at the 60s for a second. You know how it all
Yeah.
started, because the 60s you had like what, three channels in America.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you didn't have cable. You just had three channels. You had whatever shows they put on. Um, I can't remember if the late 60s you already, I don't think you had like videotapes yet, even. Like, so if you missed an episode, you missed an episode. You didn't see it until the network decided to show it again.
And because you were very limited on your networks, right? The
Yeah.
primetime spots were very sought after.
Yeah.
Um, I remember watching a documentary and they were talking about how Roddenberry was very upset when they tried to push him to date night on the network because he's like, nobody's going to be home to watch the show.
Yeah. And because you had only three channels, it wasn't like you didn't have specialized channels. You didn't have like channels that only speak to kids or only speak to
Mhm.
adults. You had like one channel for everyone, and so the show had to reach as wide of an audience as it possibly could, and to appeal to everybody. Um, and that definitely affected how the shows were, because the show had to be episodic. You couldn't have like a very long running story arc, because again there was no way for the viewers to catch up if they missed an episode.
Mhm.
And because it had to be suitable for both kids and adults, because if it was too appealing for kids, it could be dumb, it could be too dumbed down and adults wouldn't be interested. But if it was too had too many adult themes, then the kids wouldn't be interested, so families wouldn't watch.
Mhm. And the content itself, right? I mean, we're talking science fiction
Yeah.
on TV that they mainly do like family oriented, dramas or shows. Very wholesome content. And so this concept of doing like an action adventure show, while it seems like a money maker, it was very hard, I think, for them to originally sell it as a concept to go on on the network, right? They're like, "Oh, what is that? You something in space?" They're like, "Think of it as a western in space."
Yeah, I mean, westerns were really, really popular at the time, so it made sense to have it be like a sort of western.
Yeah.
And technology-wise, you didn't have a lot of special effects were very were very hard to do, and they were even harder to translate to the small screen because TVs back then they were very small. Most people, color TV just started, and most people still
Mhm.
had only black and white television screens. So while Star Trek was filmed in color, a lot of people originally experienced it in black and white.
Mhm. And the other part is the budget of the show, right? Making a sci-fi show is expensive.
Yeah.
Making it really any action adventure is expensive. So they were very mindful that they can't be spending, so much money per episode and keep the show on the air.
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of famous for it actually that the Star Trek, the original show, the original run of it only had 2 seasons, and it was very popular. But like we said about the age restriction, it was mostly popular with teenagers and young adults, and the network
Mhm.
wasn't pleased with that because they wanted the show to appeal to everybody. Um, so they canceled it, and then there was this large campaign to get it back, and they finally did get a third season. And that was, I think, the legend of the original, fan involvement in Star Trek, because it really was the fans that made the show, that got the show the third season, and the third season is what made the show popular, because after the third season it was canceled for good, but then because it had enough episode, it could be sold to syndication and run on local channels all throughout the 70s until it was revived.
Yeah. And I think that syndication, right, that concept of the rerun was new.
Yeah.
And when it was actually a concept kind of designed by the production company that was funding Star Trek, Desilu Productions. So what was interesting is, we talk about the fan base for Star Trek when it was actually airing, right?
Yeah.
Before it went into syndication and the rerun. Even then, the fan base was very small. It was small compared to some of the other shows that were in the prime spots on the networks. Um, and once they put it in syndication and they started rerunning it on, I think, something like 200 different channels, local channels across the United States, that's when more people got exposed to it at different times of the day.
Yeah.
And I think on some of those channels, like, people liked it so much they ran it all the time. And that's what I think really built up the fan base over the next several years, right? To the point that, that fan base could put in enough or have enough, I'd say, clout to petition for more Star Trek or the return of Star Trek.
Yeah, I mean, even during the 60s, this fan base may have been small in the sense that we're talking about viewership and
Mm-hmm.
general popularity, but even back then, they started like doing fan activities that were like more
Oh, yeah.
dedicated than the average show's fan base. I think the first, we talk about like the influence of Star Trek on slash fan fiction. The first slash fanfic was
Mm-hmm.
published in a zine in 1967, so 68 or something like that. And I think the fact that there were zines back then for the show speaks volumes, because it was like right after the airing of the first episode of the second season. And
I mean, just think about the concept of the fanzine, right? It's like, how much effort does it take to use the postal service to collect material for a fan base that has really no other way to communicate with each other?
exactly, exactly, it's the time, it's the era before the internet. It's the era before
Yes.
conventions were kind of rare, the concept of the fan conventions also kind of came from, it didn't start
Hmm.
with Star Trek, but they really popularized it. And um, and people just, they were so passionate about it even when it aired in the late 60s, that they started kind of, communicating with each other through mail.
Hmm.
um, yeah, and they started writing fan fiction and drawing fan art for each other because they enjoyed it so much.
And then we get to that point of, the syndication and the reruns and more exposure, a building fan base.
And that's when we start getting fan conventions in the 70s.
Meanwhile, like Roddenberry had never intended for Star Trek to stop with a third season.
Yeah. I mean, the conventions were kind of a blessing for the actors and the
Oh yeah.
production crew too, because they struggled finding work. Most of them, anyway, struggled
Hmm.
finding work after the show ended. And they were paid to come to conventions. They were paid for autographs. They were paid for pictures, for appearing panels, for selling merch. Roddenberry was very famous for making a lot of merch for the show and selling it in conventions. Um, and yeah, it really helped a lot of them. Even actors that only appeared in like one or episode got invited, and yeah.
So I think their voice was heard, right? Because this is when we get, um, the animated series.
Yeah.
While it's not the actual actors returning to the screen, they're the same voice actors for the most part.
I think only Chekhov's actor didn't come
Hmm.
back. Chekhov's
Yeah.
character was didn't come back at all, I think. But yeah, most of them did come back. Uh,
And so even though it was animated and it wasn't really a kids show, right? It was just a continuation of the Star Trek, the Enterprise crew, and the themes and the stories that those writers wanted to tell and had intended to tell in like phase 2 of Star Trek show.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the 70s, we're talking about a pretty similar TV landscape. So
Yeah.
the animated show, like the original show, kind of tried to appeal to everybody. So it was kid friendly. And animated shows, especially back then, were still seen as mostly for kids.
Yeah.
So yeah, so mostly kids. So it mostly did appeal to kids because of that. But yeah, I mean, it was a continuation pretty much. Some of the writers of the original show came back. I mean, Chekhov's actor didn't come back for acting, but he did write an episode, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
So
but
we have at this point a return of a Star Trek show, but not in the form of live action.
yeah, and we have fans keeping the interest up all throughout the 70s, which is, it's kind of
Yeah.
crazy, thinking about it. Because again, it was pre-internet.
Hmm.
Um, we didn't have, mobile phones. Just people were literally just doing it with mail, just mail, just mail and printing presses. And that takes a lot of dedication. It really does. It takes so much dedication.
That's right. In the background, the production company, right,
Yeah,
still has the rights to Star Trek.
yeah,
Um, and they've been thinking about how to bring it back, in part to the fan base, right? Because they know that there is an audience out there who wants it on the TV.
yeah. Not only do they know there is an audience out there, in the late 70s, in the early 80s, especially, merchandising becomes a big thing,
Oh yeah.
and suddenly it doesn't really matter. It does matter how many people watch your show, obviously, because you need to sell, ads. You want to sell spots for ads, but also you can make back the money with merch. Um, Even if the audience isn't very big, if it's very dedicated and is willing to spend money, um, it's you realize it's a good thing. And another thing that really played into Star Trek coming back is like the late 70s is of course the popularity of Star Wars, which again was also very heavily relied on merch. It was very popular, but it also like sold a lot of things, a lot of merchandise, and people, the production company saw the popularity of Star Wars, and they were like, "Do we have something that is kind of like Star Wars that we can put on screen?" And
Oh yeah,
maybe, yeah,
uh, and also like Close Encounters of the Third Kind was hugely popular around the same time as Star Wars. So sci-fi in of itself, or what
sci-fi
I
had
would
a moment.
call like right, sci-fi at the moment, what I would call like space fantasy,
Yeah,
um, was growing popular not just within the U.S. but internationally.
yeah, like I said, it had a moment. It's like it had a sudden boom for like a few
Hmm.
years. Um, so yeah, so in the late 70s, we saw the return of live action Star Trek in the form of movies. And yeah,
I don't know if you know this, but this is the point at which Paramount tried to launch its own network.
oh,
And their original intention was to put Star Trek on their network and have Star Trek be the thing that carried their new network into like a bigger audience base.
hmm.
Um, it didn't work out. Long story short, the network kind of failed. So this like a concept of putting like phase two of Star Trek on the television through the new network, they had to essentially like pull that back and go a different direction.
Yeah, I didn't know that, but it will be relevant because it's not the last time they'll try to do something like that.
Oh no.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, they're thinking, like who are the right people to headline the new show? I mean, obviously now we're talking about the next generation, right?
Well, first they had the movies, and the movies that used the old cast. And like the
Yeah.
movies, even though the movies weren't all great, they were steadily profitable, which is the important part as far as the studio is concerned. Yeah. Um, and like the first movie was very much, they wanted a Star Wars, but the first movie was very much, 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yes,
um,
this is true. They did bring back the cast for the motion picture
yeah, and
in the 70s. Um,
yeah, and because the movies kept being profitable, that's why in the 80s they were like, okay, we can
yeah.
do another show. But the cast was getting older. They were getting very noticeably older, and they needed to make a new show with a new cast. They couldn't
Hmm.
just continue the old show.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the point at which we get Star Trek back on the small screen, but they're also continuing at the same time to make more of the original series casted movies.
Yeah, but I think the original fan reaction for the next generation was mixed, to say the least. Um, People weren't happy. They
Hmm.
wanted the original cast back. They wanted just a continuation of the original Star Trek. There was a loud contingent of fans who was like, "That's not Star Trek. Star Trek is Kirk, Spock, and McCoy on the Enterprise."
Yeah.
Yeah,
And they were getting that, right? They were getting those movies put out in the 80s. But I mean, I think the really big one, right? The
yeah.
one that got people up in arms was The Wrath of Khan.
Well, yeah. That was of course the most popular. To this day, it's like one of the most well-known Star Trek
Yeah.
movie. Um, but
But then
again,
they had to continue that storyline and like throughout the next two movies.
yeah, I mean, the fourth one was the most profitable. It was the one,
Right.
one people most watched because it was also the most fun. um, yeah,
And then they're like, okay, we've got the original cast. Like you said, they're kind of aging out.
Yeah.
Um, and so now they're considering putting back a TV show. By this point, we're in like what the late '80s, after the mid '80s.
Yeah.
So compare the '60s, the mid '60s to the mid '80s for television. It's different.
It is different, yeah. I mean, for one thing, now everybody has color TV. I don't think anybody
Yeah,
has black and white TVs anymore by the late 80s.
you have
Maybe a few.
multiple networks,
You had multiple networks, you had cable.
cable.
Um, there was a lot more to compete with.
Hmm.
And you needed a strong cast, and you suddenly found Shakespeare trained actor from Britain to
Hmm.
headline your sci-fi show.
And it's very common now to do syndication, right?
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, you had like in the 80s, because you had so much more competition and you needed to have more
Hmm.
ads. You also, the acting wise, you needed, there was a push for a little more diversity. You
Hmm.
could get away. I mean, Star Trek kind of had pioneered this in the 60s, but the non-white, non-male cast members were still kind of more like minor characters in the background. And
Yeah,
in the 80s it was like we need something more than that. So you had more characters, actors who weren't white, more women. um, there was a tale that they wanted to add LGBT representation. Gene Roddenberry actually pushed for it, but Rick Berman kind of was against it, so that didn't
yeah.
happen. No, another thing is that the number of episodes per season, in the 60s,
Hmm.
it wasn't really set that, the first season had what, like 30 something episodes, and the second one had 20 something. TV back then, there wasn't a very, um,
A
it wasn't
formula.
yeah, there wasn't a formula yet. It was more, loose and kind of based on how things went. In the 80s there was like more of a formula. You had like the episode needed to be this long and the season needed to be that long to fit with the
Hmm.
TV season and the spots that we have between the shows.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot more going on with the scripting of the show, and I think the planning of the show. But probably what's interesting is when they brought in the next generation on the screen. At this point, they're still trying to tell somewhat of in an episodic format, right? Where you have like a small self-contained story in an episode. But because you have such a long-running show and returning characters, they're starting to play with this concept of um like looking more into the lives of the characters and kind of continuing that in the background of these episodic, like, moral of the story kind of action,
Yeah, de-
episodes.
definitely. um, yeah. We definitely get the chance for stories that we didn't have before. We have,
Hmm.
running themes, and not as much as as we'll get later on, but definitely a lot more than we had in the 60s.
Hmm.
In the 60s, there was more of an emphasis on the concept of the sci-fi story of the week.
Yeah,
And the next generation was still episodic. It wasn't like completely um it didn't have like story arcs that go on throughout all the season or all the series, but you still
yeah,
had things carry over from episode to episode.
yeah, exactly. Small things, not like big, long-running themes.
Well, kind of. I mean, look at the Klingon opera of Worf's life. I mean, that was kind of a very long storyline that kind of went along.
It did, but it was built into his character arc.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's what I'm trying to like differentiate between the original series and the other one is if you look at most of the characters in the original series, you're like, what story arc, except maybe outside of Kirk and Spock? And even then, was very it was very background to, like you said, the short story esque tale of what was happening in the episode.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even Worf, as I mentioned, you could just plop
Yeah,
down and watch a Worf episode and kind of get where he's
yeah,
at. You didn't have to like see everything previously. You mean you would get more context if you had, but you didn't have to. They would explain it to you anyway because they still knew. The videotapes were a thing now, and you could watch them, and there was syndication. But they still knew that most people just kind of watched whenever they got a chance
yeah,
and didn't especially go out and look for the episode. So they had
yeah.
to consider that.
By this point, we're getting into like the early 90s.
Yeah. Well, I mean, through the 80s, kind of convention has kind of got bigger and more
Yeah.
popular. The fandom really, the concept of fandom really started like being established in the 80s, and start to kind of pioneer it in the 70s. But in the 80s, we saw it with Star Wars, and we saw it with
Mhm.
all kinds of other franchises, Transformers, and uh, there was another sci-fi like show that had like a big um
Yeah.
forgot the name, but there are a lot of like fandoms started popping up. Fandoms really
Mhm.
started popping up. A lot of the zines you find now that are like vintage zines are from like the 80s and 90s era. They
Yeah.
really they really got a boost in the 80s.
And what was fun about the Next Generation? They just had a bigger cast, and more returning characters
Yeah,
because it went on for so long. So you had a lot more, I think, diversity in the sense of the new races that were brought forth in the Next Generation, the various cast members that fans could find appealing. If you probably were to go to a fan convention in that time in the 80s, you're seeing like a world of Star Trek
yeah. I
kind
mean,
of by this
world
point.
world world building was very very big at that time, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, like because we had like better TV and better quality and better viewing quality and better makeup and effect artists, and you had different species on Star Trek. Klingons weren't just people
Uh-huh.
with like things, with like mustaches. They were like they had glued foreheads or whatever,
Uh-huh.
and you had like all kinds of aliens with alien designs. Yeah,
This is one of the beautiful things that as the decades progress, like you said, the effects get better, the costumes get better, the diversity of the types of aliens that you see, and we continue to, I think, to see this build as just media and
yeah,
imagination really start to merge. Like everything that you imagine, you can start to create, even if it's through computer graphics on the show. You don't have to put a rug over somebody and have them crawl on the floor.
yeah, yeah. Another thing we didn't mention is during the 70s that also started is the novelizations and also like the original books
Mm,
set in the Star Trek universe. You know,
mhm.
um, there were the zines, there were fan fiction, but there was also like official books set in Star Trek universe that licensed the characters and was officially published. And that started, I think, in the 70s.
Let's not forget the comics.
And the comics, obviously. Yeah, the
Yeah.
comics too.
um, because a novelization is, like reading a story, but they had some very good artists that were designing the comics and telling equivalent to like what you would see in an episode on a few pages in a comic book,
Yeah,
and doing background stories and all sorts of things.
yeah, that's true. So yeah, we will start to see like the extended universe, what you might call. Um, it wasn't official, and the movies and the shows kind of ignored it for the most part. But it really helped keep fan involvement in the franchise.
I took a moment to just look up, like, because I know the comics were starting to be popular in the 70s. Because
Yeah,
you have Marvel coming on and all of that stuff, and it makes sense that they're going to take a franchise that they own and kind of push it into that merchandising area, right?
yeah.
Um, but in looking this up, I actually see here that it says from 1969 to 1971, there was a series of weekly Star Trek comic strips in a British comics magazine.
That's interesting.
How do I get my hands on that? Because when I think of a comic strip, I'm like, if you would open the newspaper and there would be like the funnies section, that's what we called it. And it's just
Yeah,
a bunch of comic strips. And I'm like, wait, there's Star Trek?
that's
How did I miss that
fascinating.
one?
Well, I mean, you're not in Britain, so I guess that's one thing. Um, but yeah, that's fascinating.
And then it says from 1979 to 1983, the Los Angeles Times produced a daily and Sunday comic strip based on Star Trek.
Really? Whoa.
We're going to have to go into the archives and see if we can get some of that.
Yeah, those are fascinating. Yeah, I would love to see what those were like. Especially because how could you communicate like concepts from Star Trek in like a daily strip? Daily strip is very limited.
Yeah, usually like 5 panels.
Yeah.
I don't know, but it's very interesting. There's some here that they just show it basically would run, it looks like maybe over a month or 2-month period to tell a story. So for example, here's one that ran from May 9th to July 2nd, 1983, and it was called Goodbye to Spock in the paper.
Whoa. Okay.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So yeah, we had all of this like auxiliary
Expansion of
expand,
media.
yeah, of the franchise, yeah, of the universe. Like again, the actual show and the movies completely ignored all of this. Like it was really there just to keep the fan engagement.
Yeah.
And it was actually a testament to fan engagement because those things wouldn't be published if there wasn't a demand for them.
Mhm.
So yeah. And yeah, then we get to the 90s. The next generation is becoming very popular. It's very, very popular. Um, it started out kind of slow, but it became very popular. Most fans have kind of accepted it. Like the old
Mhm.
guard that kind of was like, Star Trek is only Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. Um, they just kind of had to accept that things are changing.
Yeah.
And we had next generation, and we are starting to get the next generation is getting older, and the network is saying, okay, let's have more Star Trek shows, and suddenly we have two Star Trek shows running consecutively, um,
Mhm.
which we never had before.
And I'm trying to remember which it is, but by this point, to be syndicated, you had to run something like 6 or 7 seasons. And a lot of shows, that was their goal, right? Let me run this show or this series until we hit like the syndication mark, and then we're done.
I think the syndication mark is like 4 seasons actually. For
Yeah. I think
so yeah,
maybe you're right. Maybe the syndication mark went up in later years. I seem to
maybe.
recall, at least in the 90s or the early 2000s, by then it was like 6 seasons.
Maybe I'm not familiar with that, but it could be. I think it's more about like the number of episodes, so you would have like
Yeah,
something to
yeah.
run every, I don't know, every time period. I don't know exactly, but yeah, that makes sense. And but also it's like the fact that, like, at some point a show starts to lose steam. You
It
have you
does.
have you have like outliers like The Simpsons, but most shows kind of start to lose steam like around the fourth, fifth season or something like that.
And
um
the actors want to go on and probably do other things.
yeah, exactly, the actors don't
Are
want
they
to
going to
stay
be married
stuck.
to like 10 years on a particular show? No.
Yeah, and you have to remember, these days TV shows like can be very prestigious, but back then TV shows weren't very prestigious. Actors mostly aimed for either, the theater or movies. Those were the
Yeah.
two big things. The theater was classy, and the movies were like the big deal, the profit
Hmm.
and the fame. TV shows were something like in between. Like, it was something in between. Um, so yeah, the actors didn't want to stay married to one thing, and there was also the problem of, like, the Star Trek curse, kind of used to say, where actors who were on Star Trek kind of became so attached to the franchise that they weren't cast as anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All they see you is as, Captain Picard.
Yeah,
Although
well, I
we
mean,
do know Patrick Stewart, he's not a good example because
yeah,
he
Patrick
obviously had a
Stewart
career before and a
and
long career.
after. Yeah, Patrick Stewart is also kind of an outlier, but you don't see, like,
Yeah.
most of the other actors. You don't really see in other
Yeah.
things, like, yeah, Bert Spiner is Data forever. Like, yeah,
But what was nice is by the time we have all these movies coming out, right? They're like in their third, fourth original series movie. They've got the next generation um starting. You have actors who launch their careers by appearing in the Star Trek franchise.
yeah, yeah, that's true.
It's like a stepping stone for some of the younger actors coming in, and they do like appearance in a movie, or um they did we have someone like Whoopi Goldberg who's actually already famous.
Yeah, Whoopi Goldberg joining in on the Next Generation kind of saved the Next Generation, because, like I
Yeah.
said, the first season wasn't well received, and the network kind of wondered if they should have more seasons. And then
Hmm.
Whoopi Goldberg, who was a fan of the original series, came by and said, "Are you making more Star Trek? Because if so, I want to be on it." And they were like, "We'll make more Star Trek if you're on it."
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in a sense, they are, we're talking what, like 6-ish years after the Next Generation has been on the air, and then we come along with Deep Space Nine.
Yeah. Deep Space Nine wasn't as popular as the Next Generation,
Hmm.
and but it did have. It's the first Star Trek show to really have a long arc, a long story arc,
Yes.
like season to season story arc, like not even a seasonal story arc, but a story arc that stretches across the entire series.
Yeah. Primarily being where they're based, and the tensions and going on. The
Yeah.
races coming in and out of the wormhole.
Yeah, because that was like starting out in the 90s in all kinds
Yeah.
of TV shows. You can say it started out with like Twin Peaks. I think it was the
Right.
first TV show that really took TV as a serious format. You can say.
I don't
Um,
know. For me, in the 90s, it was definitely the X Files.
yeah. No, the
Because
X was definitely popular, but, like, you have like a big name director like David Lynch making a TV show with a long arcing story, and it's like, whoa, we can actually do that.
I guess I compare it to X Files because they had the episodic format, like the
Yeah.
Next Generation. Like they were going to investigate the weird things, and they would conclude that investigation within an episode. But the overarching theme from the very beginning is what carried the show through so many seasons.
Yeah.
Um, you really begin to see that, like you said, that turn in the formatting of the show with Deep Space Nine into those long, long arching themes.
Yeah, and honestly, it may have kind of been ahead of its time in a sense
Hmm.
because people still, for the most part, kind of watched shows as they came on. Toward the late 90s, you already had DVDs, on top of like uh, videotapes, but it was still just kind of mostly people watching whatever was on TV. And a lot of times people were kind of tuning in and kind of feeling lost because they missed an episode or two and they weren't really, the casual fans weren't just going to go out and search for the episode they missed. So it wasn't as successful as The Next Generation.
They had started Deep Space Nine for a couple years and then started another show.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So because it wasn't as popular, it never ran on its own. I think it was maybe like the third season was the only season that was like completely on its own.
Uh
Because the
huh.
Next Generation was continuing for the first two seasons of Deep Space Nine. We had the sixth and seventh season of the Next Generation, and then
Hmm.
around the fourth season of Deep Space Nine, we had the third show, Voyager, Star Trek Voyager. Yeah, which it kind of it matches what you said about like you remember in the early 80s when you said the Paramount wanted to launch its own network.
Oh
Well,
yeah.
in the late 90s there was also an attempt to launch a network, UPN.
Yes.
UPN was launched and they put Voyager on it
Voyager on that one.
as the flagship show to attract viewers.
Yep.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure UPN is the United Paramount Network.
yeah,
Um,
probably, I don't know.
it was still around, but they were still trying to get it off the ground by that point.
Yeah,
That's interesting, right? Because now you have essentially a show that is again trying to um, be the star of the network, right? The one that brings in the viewers to the network, and you have to go to the network to watch it.
yeah, and I mean it kind of worked. Voyager was more popular than Deep Space Nine, um, and I think part of it also was that like they saw that Deep Space Nine was kind of not doing so well with viewership, so they went back to the Next Generation concept of more episodic
Yeah,
episodes.
yeah,
Yeah, more episode. No big. I mean, there is the big arc of the concept of the show. They're lost. They're in the other side of the galaxy and they're trying to get home. But you didn't have like a more involved week to week episode arc, seasonal arc. You
yeah.
had like yeah, you had like an episode of the week sort of deal.
Hmm. Deep Space Nine was very heavily serialized,
Yeah,
and in a sense, very darker than some of the other shows with
yeah,
the
definitely.
ongoing war, right?
Yeah, and that's also an interesting thing because the concept of Roger can very easily fit into a very dark theme. I mean, they're lost, they're eh, decades away from home. Um, they don't know if they'll ever come back. They're trying to find, everything they care about is like on the other side of the galaxy, and
Yeah.
they're stuck in this really unfamiliar place with no resources and no help. Um, but no, it's actually a very very light show. Episodic, not very serious or dark. Yeah. We went back to the Next Generation formula.
I mean, we shouldn't forget they're still continuing to make movies.
Yeah, and now they're
They've just moved
moving
into the
on
next
to
generation.
exactly, they're moved on to the Next Generation movies. um the first one was very popular, I think. Generations, I mean, it did advertise the clash between Kirk and Picard, so fans were very excited about that. And a lot of them were ended up being disappointed. um and then you had First Contact, which is probably still one of the best Star Trek movies ever made, like very popular, and it also tells the story of the beginning of the Star Trek universe, basically. um they had the two other Next Generation movies, and they
Yeah.
kind of flopped. They flopped very hard.
Yeah.
And because they flopped so hard, there wasn't any interest in making more movies based on the shows.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Deep Space Nine never got a movie,
Mhm.
and Voyager also never got a movie.
Yeah, very good point.
Yeah.
Especially when you then consider how long it took them to come back to the movies.
Yeah. And Voyager, despite being popular toward the end, the viewership really went down. UPN also wasn't a very successful network.
No, it was definitely not doing very well at all.
Yeah.
So they're like, what do we have to do now?
Yeah. And the answer was more Star Trek.
Yeah.
So
And
after,
this time the prequel.
yeah. So I think the interesting part is that the network kind of got the impression that there was a sort of Star Trek fatigue, I think.
Hmm.
So when Enterprise launched, it was just called Enterprise. It wasn't called Star Trek Enterprise. It was just
Hmm.
Enterprise for the first 2 seasons.
Hmm.
And it was a Star Trek show. It was set in the Star Trek universe, but it tried to market itself as something very different.
Yep.
And the early 2000s also had a small boom in sci-fi. You had Battlestar Galactica, and you had Sliders, and you had Quantum
Hmm.
Leap, and you had
Hmm.
how's it? Stargate, and there was a lot of of sci-fi related TV shows that were very popular. So
And we should probably mention that like Quantum Leap predates Enterprise, right?
yeah, yeah,
But yet has the same headlining actor,
yeah,
Scott Bakula.
yeah. But it was because of the late 90s, early 2000s sci-fi boom that they gave Star Trek one more chance, and the chance was
Yep.
Enterprise. Yeah.
Yep. And then they've done their 2 seasons, and then this is about when 9/11 happened in America.
Yeah.
Um, which affected what they did for the third season.
Yes, very much so. Yes.
Talk about dark.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not qualified to talk about how 9/11 affected the TV landscape in America. I think it's something that will be looked more at, in the future, because
Mm-hmm.
it certainly had some effect, a very interesting effect. Um, and I think the interesting part is that for the most part, shows became less political, but Star Trek decided to go more political, kind of. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, it very much did take a turn for the dark. Some might say for the show's benefit, because the first 2 seasons were kind of boring.
You said it, not me.
Yeah, I think it's a common sentiment that the first 2 seasons are very
Yeah.
boring,
Yeah.
um, kind of
You know,
slow. Yeah.
and there's one thing I want to mention here. We talked about how in the next generation they're trying to like bring more women in. Um, by this point, you have at least 1 to 2, I'd say,
I think
important
two.
females in or female roles in the Star Trek shows at that point.
I think there's the two. Every show has two main characters.
Yeah.
Voyager had three, which is why it was the female show, because it had three
Yep.
instead of two. So yeah.
And we're
Um,
getting some other representation.
no, I said, and then Enterprise kind of walked back on that.
Yes. Yes, it did.
Yeah, because they did have two main female characters, but we once again got back to the point where the non-white characters are basically set dressings, to say it
Mhm.
nicely. um and the sexualization got really, really,
Really bad
really
in
bad.
Enterprise.
Yeah, it started in Voyager. When Seven
Yeah.
of Nine joined, Voyager got really very. She was very much sexual. She was very much there to be the eye candy.
It's true.
Yeah.
But I just remember the shower scene in Enterprise.
But yeah, the Enterprise, the pilot of Enterprise was, yeah, that was something else. And it was also it was also very much early 2000s, like the early 2000s when it came to women representation. That was very much like that everywhere, basically.
Hmm.
So gone are the days of Star Trek being like an all ages, family friendly, bring the kids to kind of
Hmm.
deal, you know.
There's definitely some more adult content in the later Star Trek shows.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Enterprise, I did for do think that the Enterprise became better after the first season. The fourth season was very, very good. Apart from the last episode, it was very good.
Hmm.
But unfortunately, viewership wasn't very patient with it, so it just wasn't strong enough to keep going, and that's where Star Trek was cancelled. Star Trek was cancelled completely. There was no Star Trek for the first time since the Next Generation in the late 80s.
Yeah. So this is what, like 2003,
And
four.
yeah, yeah, something like that.
Yeah. And we then go through a period of a few years without Star Trek.
Yeah, I mean, we still had, like in the 70s, we still had conventions, we still had,
We'll had
you know,
reruns.
we had reruns, we had what was I going to say? We had, fan activity was still going strong. We had the extended universe, novels, everything else was still going on. But there was no official Star Trek content for about 5 to 6 years.
Although I do want to say that's no official Star Trek content on the screen,
Yeah,
big
yeah,
or
that's what.
small.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
still had like novelizations and comics and
yeah, yeah,
some
definitely.
of those things, but they were just kind of, extending the canon, or not really the canon, but just extending some of the storylines and the character arcs from what we already had before.
Yeah, and much like with the 80s, with the late 70s and the 80s, what caused the revitalization of the franchise is a movie.